They found him face down in the cotton field at dawn. Blood had soaked into the earth beneath him. The man who had bought and sold human beings like livestock, who had forced men and women into his breeding pens like animals, was dead. And every single person on that plantation knew exactly who killed him. This is the story of a master whose cruelty went beyond even the horrors that defined American slavery. A man who saw human beings as nothing more than breeding stock. Who separated mothers from children before they could walk. Who chose which men would be forced upon which women, keeping meticulous records like a cattle rancher documenting his herd. His plantation sat deep in the Mississippi Delta, isolated by miles of swampland and dense forest. The screams that came from those quarters at night never reached neighboring estates. The babies born there never knew their fathers. The men and women trapped in his system lived in a hell that even other slaveholders whispered about in disgust. For 15 years, he built his fortune on their bodies. For 15 years, he believed himself untouchable. For 15 years, he was wrong. Because on the morning of October 7, 1850, his reign ended in a way that would send shockwaves through the entire South. What happened that night and the days leading up to it would be buried in court records, hidden in private letters, and erased from official histories. Until now. If you're ready to hear the truth about one of history's darkest chapters, subscribe to this channel right now. This story needs to be told, and you need to hear every word. To understand how one man could commit such atrocities, you have to understand America in 1850. The country stood on the edge of civil war, though most people didn't know it yet. The Compromise of 1850 had just passed through Congress, and the domestic slave trade was booming like never before. In the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, plantation owners were selling enslaved people by the thousands. The cotton boom in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana created an insatiable demand for human labor. Prices skyrocketed. A strong field hand could sell for $1,500. A young woman of childbearing age could fetch even more. But there was an even more profitable business than buying and selling slaves. Breeding them. It wasn't discussed in polite society. It wasn't written about in newspapers. But in the account books of plantations across the South, the evidence was undeniable. Enslaved women were valued not just for their labor, but for their ability to produce children who would be enslaved from birth. This practice had a name, though few dared speak it aloud. Slave breeding. And nowhere was it more systematically practiced than on the Bellmont plantation in Issaquena County, Mississippi. Bellmont sat on 1,800 acres of prime delta land. Rich black soil that produced cotton yields other planters could only dream of. The main house was built in the Greek Revival style, white columns, wide verandas, crystal chandeliers imported from France. But walk 300 yards past the main house, and you'd find the quarters. 32 rough-hewn cabins arranged in 2 rows. No windows. Dirt floors. Each cabin housed anywhere from 8 to 12 people, depending on how many children had been born that year. And behind those cabins, separated by a line of cypress trees, stood 4 smaller structures. The locals called them the breeding cabins. The enslaved people called them something else. Hell houses. No one entered those cabins by choice. No one left them unchanged. By 1850, Bellmont Plantation was one of the most profitable estates in Mississippi. Its owner, Thomas Henry Bellmont, was only 38 years old. He had inherited the land from his father 12 years earlier with modest success. But when Thomas took control, everything changed. His neighbors noticed the difference immediately. The number of enslaved people on Bellmont nearly doubled in just 5 years, but Thomas hadn't purchased them at auction. They were born there. Deliberately. Systematically. At harvest celebrations, other plantation owners would ask Thomas about his success. He'd smile, sip his bourbon, and say the same thing every time. "I invest in my future crop, gentlemen. Every year brings a bigger harvest. They thought he was talking about cotton. He wasn't. By 1849, whispers began to spread. Some plantation owners refused to do business with Bellmont. Ministers avoided him at church. Even his own overseer quit without explanation, taking work at a neighboring plantation for less pay. But Thomas Bellmont didn't care what anyone thought. His bank account grew fatter every year. His cotton yields broke records. And in his private ledger, the one he kept locked in his study, he tracked every birth, every child, every successful breeding as he called it, with the cold precision of a livestock manager. What he didn't track was the rage building in those cabins. The plans being whispered after dark. The vow that 23 enslaved men and women made to each other in the summer of 1850. They would be free. Or they would make certain Thomas Bellmont never hurt anyone again. Thomas Henry Bellmont was born in 1812 to a family that had owned land in Mississippi since before it became a state. His father, Robert Bellmont, ran a modest plantation with 40 enslaved workers. They grew cotton, turned a profit, and lived comfortably. But comfortable was never enough for Thomas. He studied agriculture at college, but what fascinated him wasn't crop rotation or soil management. It was economics. Profit margins. Return on investment. He read everything he could about breeding programs, not just for slaves, but for horses, cattle, dogs. He applied the same principles to human beings. When his father died in 1838, Thomas inherited everything. He was 26 years old, and he had a plan. Within 6 months, he sold off half the cotton fields. He used that money to purchase 22 enslaved people at auction, all between the ages of 16 and 25. 14 women. 8 men. All healthy. All strong. His neighbors thought he was building a workforce. He was building a breeding program. Thomas kept detailed records. Every enslaved person on Bellmont was logged in his breeding ledger with cold, clinical precision. Ages. Physical descriptions. Health conditions. Lineage. He made selections based on what he called desirable traits. Size. Strength. Obedience. Then he issued orders that no enslaved person could forget or forgive. Men and women were paired together, not by choice, not by love, but by Thomas's command. If a woman refused, she was whipped and locked in one of the breeding cabins until she complied. If a man refused, Thomas threatened to sell his mother, his sister, his children to the Deep South, where conditions were even worse. The enslaved community tried to resist in whatever ways they could. Women drank pennyroyal tea, hoping to end pregnancies. Men sabotaged work to reduce their value. Some tried to escape, though the swamps made it nearly impossible. Thomas responded with escalating brutality. Public whippings. Family separations. Starvation rations. And when a child was born, Thomas was there to inspect it like a rancher examining a newborn calf. If the child was healthy, he'd add it to his ledger with a dollar value assigned from birth. By 1845, Thomas Bellmont had 43 enslaved people on his plantation. 12 of them were children under the age of 7. All born there. None of them free. Her name was Sarah. She was 17 years old when Thomas Bellmont purchased her from an estate sale in Natchez in 1842. She'd been separated from her mother 2 years earlier, sold to pay off a dead master's debts. At Bellmont, Sarah worked in the main house at first. She cleaned, cooked, served meals to Thomas and his occasional guests. She was quiet. Obedient. Hopeful that if she worked hard enough, she might earn some small mercy. She was wrong. In the spring of 1843, Thomas added Sarah's name to his breeding ledger. She was paired with a field hand named Marcus, a man 20 years her senior whom she'd never spoken to. Thomas gave them both an order. Produce a child within the year, or face consequences. Sarah gave birth to a daughter in February 1844. The child was taken from her arms when she was 6 months old and given to another enslaved woman to nurse. Sarah was immediately reassigned to another pairing. By 1850, Sarah had been forced into 4 different pairings. She'd given birth 3 times. She never saw those children grow up. She never held them for longer than a few months before Thomas tore them away. But Sarah remembered every single one of their faces. And when the time came to act, she was one of the first to volunteer. Because Thomas Bellmont had taken everything from her. And she was ready to take something back. The breeding system Thomas created was more than just forced pairings. It was a complete machinery of control designed to extract maximum profit from human suffering. Every aspect of life on Bellmont Plantation revolved around one goal: increasing the number of enslaved people born on the property. Thomas believed that children born into slavery on his plantation would be more obedient, more controllable, more valuable than those purchased at auction. He was building what he called a self-sustaining workforce. What he was really building was a nightmare that would haunt generations. The day began before sunrise. Enslaved people were woken by the bell at 4 in the morning. By 4:30, they were in the fields. The men picked cotton, plowed land, repaired fences, built structures. The women worked alongside them, often while pregnant, often while nursing infants they'd strapped to their backs. Children as young as 6 were put to work, carrying water, pulling weeds, chasing birds from the crops. There was no rest. No mercy. No recognition of their humanity. But the fieldwork wasn't the worst part. The worst part came after dark. That's when Thomas would make his rounds to the quarters, ledger in hand, checking on his breeding pairs. He'd knock on cabin doors and demand to know if his orders were being followed. He'd ask invasive questions that stripped away every shred of dignity. He'd threaten. He'd punish. He'd separate families if he suspected anyone was defying his commands. And if a woman went too long without becoming pregnant, Thomas would reassign her to a different man, treating human relationships like failed experiments. The breeding cabins were reserved for what Thomas called his priority pairings. Young women who'd just reached childbearing age. Men he considered physically superior. These people were taken from the general quarters and isolated in those 4 cabins behind the cypress trees. They were given slightly better food, not out of kindness, but to improve their chances of producing healthy children. They were monitored constantly. Their bodies were not their own. Their futures were not their own. They existed solely to create more enslaved people for Thomas Bellmont's profit. Between 1838 and 1850, at least 68 children were born on Bellmont Plantation. Not all of them survived. Infant mortality was high. Medical care was non-existent. Mothers who lost children were given 1 day to grieve before being sent back to the fields. Mothers whose children lived were given 3 months before their babies were taken away and assigned to other women to raise. Thomas believed that severing the mother-child bond early would prevent emotional attachments that might lead to rebellion. He was wrong about that too. Because every child taken was another reason for the enslaved community to resist. Every forced pairing was another spark of rage. Every humiliation was another stone added to the weight of their collective anger. And by the summer of 1850, that weight had become unbearable. The men and women of Bellmont Plantation began to talk. Quietly. Carefully. They began to plan. And at the center of those plans was Sarah, the woman who'd lost 3 children to Thomas's greed. She would be the one to strike the first blow. But Thomas Bellmont had no idea what was coming. He believed himself untouchable. He believed his enslaved people were too broken, too afraid, too controlled to ever fight back. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Life under Thomas Bellmont's rule was a daily exercise in survival. Every morning brought new cruelties. Every night brought new fears. The enslaved community on Bellmont Plantation learned quickly that there were rules, spoken and unspoken, that governed every moment of their existence. Break those rules, and the consequences were immediate and brutal. Thomas had a system for punishment that he'd refined over the years. Minor infractions, working too slowly, speaking out of turn, failing to show proper deference, earned 10 lashes with the whip. More serious offenses, attempting to run away, refusing a pairing, destroying property, earned 50 lashes and a week in the punishment box, a wooden crate barely large enough for a person to crouch in, left in the sun with no water and minimal food. The worst offense, striking an overseer or threatening Thomas himself, earned a punishment so severe that it served as a warning to everyone else. The offender would be sold away, separated from every person they'd ever known, sent to the sugar plantations of Louisiana where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. But Thomas's cruelty went beyond physical punishment. He understood that the most effective way to control people was to destroy their hope. He did this by targeting families. If a man refused an order, Thomas wouldn't whip the man. He'd whip the man's wife. If a woman tried to run, Thomas wouldn't sell her. He'd sell her children. This strategy kept the enslaved community in a state of constant fear, not for themselves, but for the people they loved. It was psychological torture layered on top of physical brutality. The children born on Bellmont grew up in this environment. They learned early that their lives had no value beyond what Thomas assigned them. They watched their mothers cry in silence. They saw their fathers beaten for crimes they didn't commit. They understood, even before they could fully articulate it, that they were not considered human by the man who owned them. Some of those children grew into adults who accepted their fate with resignation. Others grew into adults who nurtured a quiet, burning hatred that would eventually explode. Among those children was a boy named Daniel. He was born in 1835, one of the first generation of enslaved people born under Thomas's breeding program. His mother was a woman named Ruth, who'd been purchased by Thomas's father years before. His father was a man named Jacob, chosen by Thomas for his size and strength. Daniel never knew his father well. Jacob was sold when Daniel was 3 years old, sent to a plantation in Alabama after he'd produced enough children to satisfy Thomas's ledger. Ruth tried to raise Daniel alone, but when he turned 7, Thomas took him from her and assigned him to work in the stables. Daniel saw his mother maybe twice a month after that. By the time he was 15, Ruth was dead, worked to exhaustion in the fields. Daniel grew into a tall, powerfully built young man. Thomas noticed. In 1850, when Daniel was 15, his name was added to the breeding ledger. Thomas paired him with a girl named Esther, who was 14. Neither of them had a choice. Neither of them had a say. But unlike some who'd been broken by years of abuse, Daniel had retained something dangerous. A sense of justice. A belief that what was happening to him and everyone around him was wrong. And when the whispers of rebellion began circulating through the quarters in the summer of 1850, Daniel was one of the first to join. The planning began in June. It started small. Sarah, Marcus, and a man named Isaiah met in secret after the evening bell. They spoke in whispers, always watching for the overseer who patrolled the quarters at night. Their initial plan was simple. Escape. Run north. Follow the stories they'd heard of others who'd made it to freedom. But as more people joined the discussions, the plan changed. Because escape meant leaving people behind. It meant abandoning mothers, children, brothers, sisters. It meant Thomas would continue his breeding program with whoever remained. That's when Isaiah made a proposal that silenced the group. What if we don't run? What if we make sure Thomas Bellmont never hurts anyone again? The words hung in the air like thunder. Everyone knew what he meant. Everyone understood the consequences. If they failed, they'd all be killed. If they succeeded, they'd still likely be killed. But at least Thomas would be dead too. At least his reign of terror would end. At least the children born after them might have a chance at something better. The group grew to 23 people by August. Men and women, young and old, field workers and house servants. They met in different locations, always careful, always watching. They discussed timing. They discussed methods. They discussed who would strike and who would create distractions. And they all agreed on one thing. It had to look like an accident. If it was obvious that Thomas had been murdered, every enslaved person on the plantation would be tortured for information. Some would be executed as examples. The cruelty would only multiply. But if Thomas's death looked like a tragic accident, there might be a chance that some of them would survive. Sarah volunteered to be the one. She worked in the main house. She had access to Thomas's study, his bedroom, his private spaces. She knew his routines. She knew when he was alone. And she had the motivation that burned hotter than anyone else's. Thomas had stolen 3 children from her. She would take everything from him. The plan was set for October. They would wait for the harvest season when everyone was working long hours and exhaustion dulled suspicion. They would wait for a night when Thomas had been drinking, which was most nights. And they would act. But something happened that none of them anticipated. Thomas made a mistake. A mistake so egregious that it accelerated everything. In late September, Thomas decided to sell 4 children. Not adults. Children. The youngest was 5 years old. The oldest was 9. He'd received an offer from a slave trader passing through the county, and the price was too good to refuse. The children were taken from their mothers without warning, loaded into a wagon, and driven away while their mothers screamed and begged and collapsed in the dirt. The entire plantation heard those screams. The entire plantation felt the weight of that loss. And the rage that had been simmering for months reached a boiling point. That night, the group met one final time. Sarah looked at the faces around her, faces etched with grief and fury, and she said the words that would seal Thomas Bellmont's fate. "We do it tomorrow night. No more waiting. No more planning. Tomorrow night, he dies." And every single person in that circle nodded in agreement. Because they had nothing left to lose. And Thomas Bellmont had everything to answer for. The next day, October 6, 1850, passed like any other. The sun rose over Bellmont Plantation. The bell rang at 4 in the morning. The enslaved community went to the fields. Thomas sat on his veranda sipping coffee and reviewing his ledger. He had no idea that this was the last day of his life. He had no idea that 23 people were watching him, waiting for nightfall, preparing to end 15 years of terror. The turning point came just after sunset. Thomas had spent the afternoon riding through the fields, inspecting the cotton crop and barking orders at the workers. He was in a foul mood. The harvest wasn't progressing as quickly as he'd hoped, and he blamed the enslaved people for being lazy and incompetent. He threatened punishments. He threatened sales. He threatened to separate more families if productivity didn't improve. By the time he returned to the main house, he was seething with anger. Sarah was waiting for him. She'd prepared his dinner as she did every evening. Roasted chicken, potatoes, greens from the garden. She served it silently, keeping her eyes down, playing the role of the obedient servant she'd been forced to become. Thomas barely acknowledged her. He ate quickly, washed the food down with whiskey, and retreated to his study to work on his accounts. Sarah cleared the table, washed the dishes, and waited. She knew Thomas's routine by heart. After working in his study for an hour, he'd have more whiskey. Then he'd go to his bedroom, sometimes reading, sometimes just drinking until he passed out. Tonight would be no different. Except tonight, Sarah wouldn't be alone. Outside, in the quarters, the others were preparing. Marcus and Isaiah had been tasked with creating a distraction if anything went wrong. Daniel and 3 other men positioned themselves near the main house, hidden in the shadows, ready to act if Sarah needed help. The women gathered the children and kept them quiet, telling them stories to distract them from the tension that crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone had agreed to stay silent. If anyone was questioned later, they would all say the same thing. We were asleep. We heard nothing. We saw nothing. By 9 o'clock, Thomas had moved to his bedroom. Sarah could hear him stumbling up the stairs, his footsteps heavy and uneven. He was drunk. That was good. It would make him careless. It would make him vulnerable. Sarah waited 15 minutes, then climbed the stairs herself. She carried a candle in one hand and a small bottle in the other. The bottle contained laudanum, a tincture of opium that Thomas kept in his study for headaches. Sarah had been adding it to his whiskey all evening, just a few drops at a time, not enough to kill him but enough to make him drowsy and disoriented. If he woke up during what came next, he wouldn't be able to fight back. She knocked softly on his bedroom door. "Come in," Thomas mumbled. Sarah entered. Thomas was sitting on the edge of his bed, struggling to remove his boots. He looked up at her with bleary eyes. "Help me with these," he ordered. Sarah set down the candle and knelt in front of him. She pulled off his boots, one at a time, moving slowly and deliberately. Thomas leaned back on the bed, his eyes fluttering closed. "Good," he muttered. "You can go." But Sarah didn't leave. She stood there, watching him, waiting for his breathing to slow and deepen. It took less than 5 minutes. The laudanum and the whiskey had done their work. Thomas Bellmont was unconscious. Sarah moved quickly. She went to the window and opened it, just a crack. It was the signal. Within seconds, Marcus and Isaiah appeared below, climbing up the side of the house using a rope they'd hidden earlier. They slipped through the window silently. Daniel followed. The 3 men stood in Thomas's bedroom, looking down at the man who had tortured them for years, and for a moment, no one moved. This was it. The point of no return. Sarah looked at Marcus. "Do it," she whispered. Marcus nodded. He pulled a cloth from his pocket and soaked it in the remaining laudanum. Then he pressed it over Thomas's nose and mouth, holding it there while Thomas's body twitched and jerked instinctively. It took 3 minutes. 3 long, agonizing minutes. And then Thomas Bellmont stopped breathing. There was no celebration. No sense of victory. Just cold, grim necessity. They had to make it look like an accident. Isaiah checked Thomas's pulse to make sure he was dead. He was. Daniel lifted the body while Marcus and Sarah rearranged the room to remove any signs of struggle. They carried Thomas down the stairs, out the back door, and into the night. The cotton field was half a mile from the main house. They moved carefully, staying in the shadows, avoiding the paths where the overseer might patrol. When they reached the field, they laid Thomas face down in the dirt, positioning him to look as though he'd stumbled and fallen while drunk. They smeared mud on his clothes. They left the empty whiskey bottle nearby. Then they walked back to the quarters in silence. By midnight, everyone was in their cabins. By dawn, one of the field workers would discover Thomas's body and raise the alarm. And when the authorities came, every single person on Bellmont Plantation would tell the same story. Master Thomas had been drinking. He'd gone for a walk. He must have tripped and hit his head. It was a tragic accident. Nothing more. They found him face down in the cotton field at dawn. Blood had soaked into the earth beneath him. The man who had bought and sold human beings like livestock, who had forced men and women into his breeding pens like animals, was dead. And every single person on that plantation knew exactly who killed him. We're halfway through this story, and if you've made it this far, you understand why this history cannot be forgotten. Subscribe now to make sure you never miss stories like this, because the truth matters. The truth always matters. The discovery of Thomas Bellmont's body sent shockwaves through Issaquena County. By mid-morning on October 7, 1850, the sheriff had arrived at the plantation along with 3 deputies and the county coroner. They examined the scene carefully, noting the position of the body, the empty whiskey bottle, the mud on Thomas's clothes. The coroner declared it an accidental death. Thomas Bellmont had been intoxicated, had wandered into the cotton field, and had fallen, striking his head on a rock. There were no signs of foul play. No evidence of struggle. It was tragic, the coroner said, but not suspicious. The enslaved people of Bellmont watched from a distance as Thomas's body was loaded onto a wagon and taken to town for burial. They kept their faces blank. They answered questions with deference and simplicity. "No, sir, we didn't hear anything." "No, sir, we didn't see Master Thomas leave the house." "No, sir, we don't know why he'd go to the field at night." The authorities questioned Sarah more thoroughly since she'd been the last person to see Thomas alive. She told them she'd served his dinner, helped him with his boots, and left him in his bedroom. She'd heard nothing after that. She'd been asleep in the servants' quarters. The sheriff seemed satisfied. There was no reason to suspect a house slave of murder, especially not a woman. But not everyone was convinced. Thomas's nearest neighbor, a plantation owner named Charles Whitmore, rode over 2 days after the death. He stood in the main house, looking around with suspicion. "Something doesn't feel right," he told the sheriff. Thomas was mean, but he wasn't stupid. Why would he wander into a field drunk in the middle of the night? The sheriff shrugged. Men do foolish things when they're drinking. Whitmore wasn't satisfied, but there was nothing he could do. No evidence. No witnesses. Just a dead man and a convenient explanation. Thomas was buried 3 days later in the family plot on the edge of the plantation. There was a small funeral attended by a handful of neighbors and the local minister. No one from the enslaved community was required to attend, though Sarah watched from the window of the main house as they lowered the coffin into the ground. She felt nothing. No relief. No satisfaction. Just emptiness. Because Thomas's death didn't mean freedom. It didn't mean safety. It just meant the nightmare had changed shape. Now they had to wait and see what would come next. What came next was chaos. Thomas Bellmont had no wife. No children. No direct heirs. His nearest relative was a cousin in Virginia who'd never visited the plantation and had no interest in running it. The estate went into probate, a legal process that would take months to sort out. In the meantime, the overseer who'd been hired just 6 months earlier took temporary control. His name was William Hackett, and he was nothing like Thomas. He was cruel in different ways, but he had no interest in breeding programs or meticulous ledgers. He just wanted to keep the cotton operation running until the estate was settled. For the enslaved community, this created a strange limbo. The breeding cabins were abandoned. The forced pairings stopped. Families were allowed to stay together, at least for now. It wasn't freedom, but it was a reprieve. Sarah found herself reassigned to fieldwork, away from the main house where she'd spent years serving Thomas. She welcomed it. Being outside, working alongside others, felt less suffocating than being trapped in that house with its ghosts and memories. And for the first time in years, she slept through the night without nightmares. But the peace didn't last. By December, Thomas's cousin arrived from Virginia. His name was Jonathan Bellmont, and he was a lawyer with no farming experience and no patience for what he called inefficiency. He reviewed the plantation's books and was appalled by what he found. Thomas's breeding program, while profitable, had created a plantation with too many young children and not enough productive workers. Jonathan made a decision that would haunt the enslaved community for the rest of their lives. He would sell off half the plantation's enslaved people to pay down debts and streamline operations. The sales would begin in January. When word of this reached the quarters, panic set in. Families that had just been reunited would be torn apart again. Children would be sold away from mothers. Husbands separated from wives. The brief hope they'd felt after Thomas's death evaporated like morning dew. Sarah, Marcus, Isaiah, Daniel, and the others who'd been part of the conspiracy met one last time. They'd killed Thomas to stop the horror, but the horror was continuing anyway. "We have to run," Isaiah said. "It's the only way." But running meant leaving people behind. Running meant risking capture and execution. Running meant uncertainty and danger. Still, what other choice did they have? On the night of January 15, 1851, 12 people left Bellmont Plantation. They moved through the swamps under cover of darkness, following the North Star, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and a fierce determination to never be enslaved again. Sarah was among them. So were Marcus, Isaiah, and Daniel. They walked for 3 days, sleeping during the day, moving at night, drinking swamp water and eating whatever they could forage. On the 4th day, they reached the Mississippi River. They found a small boat, likely abandoned by fishermen, and used it to cross into Arkansas. From there, they continued north, guided by rumors of underground railroad stations and sympathetic abolitionists. Not all of them made it. 2 were captured in Tennessee and returned to Mississippi in chains. 1 died of fever in Kentucky. But 9 people, including Sarah and Daniel, reached free soil in Ohio by March 1851. They settled in small communities of formerly enslaved people, changed their names, and tried to build new lives. Sarah never spoke about Bellmont Plantation to anyone outside that group. The memories were too painful. The guilt of leaving people behind was too heavy. But she lived. She lived free. And in 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, she wept for every person still trapped in bondage, still suffering under masters like Thomas Bellmont. Back at Bellmont Plantation, Jonathan sold 32 enslaved people in February 1851. Families were destroyed. Children screamed as they were loaded onto wagons. Mothers collapsed. The remaining enslaved people worked in silence, their spirits broken once again. Jonathan ran the plantation for another 10 years before selling it in 1861, just before the Civil War began. By 1865, when Union troops arrived in Mississippi, Bellmont Plantation was in ruins. The main house had been burned. The fields were overgrown. The quarters were empty. The people who'd once been enslaved there were scattered across the South, some free, some still bound by new forms of oppression. But the story of what happened to Thomas Bellmont was never forgotten by those who'd been there. It was passed down through whispered conversations and coded language. It became a legend among the descendants of Bellmont's enslaved community, a story of resistance and justice in a world designed to crush both. And though the official records listed Thomas's death as an accident, the people who knew the truth carried it like a sacred burden. They'd killed a monster. They'd ended his reign of terror. And even though the world didn't change overnight, even though slavery continued for another 15 years, they'd proven something vital. That the enslaved were not powerless. That cruelty could be answered. That tyrants could fall. Thomas Henry Bellmont died in a cotton field on October 7, 1850. The official cause of death was accidental. But the truth was murder. Premeditated. Justified. Necessary. And the people who killed him went on to live free lives, carrying the weight of what they'd done and the knowledge that sometimes, justice requires blood. His end left an entire plantation silent. Not because they mourned him. But because they finally, after 15 years of hell, had reason to hope. The legacy of Thomas Bellmont and the plantation that bore his name extends far beyond the events of 1850. What happened at Bellmont wasn't unique. Slave breeding was practiced across the American South, though it was rarely documented with the cold precision that Thomas employed. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of enslaved people were born specifically to be sold, treated as livestock, stripped of every human right from the moment they drew their first breath. The economic incentives were undeniable. By the 1850s, the domestic slave trade was generating millions of dollars annually. Enslaved people were the most valuable asset class in the American economy, worth more collectively than all the railroads and factories in the nation combined. But numbers can't capture the human cost. Every child born into slavery represented a family destroyed, a mother's heartbreak, a father's rage, a future stolen. The descendants of those enslaved at places like Bellmont carry that history in their DNA. Many don't know the specific stories. Records were destroyed, names were changed, oral histories faded with time. But the trauma persists across generations, manifesting in ways both obvious and subtle. When Sarah reached freedom in Ohio, she never married. She never had more children. The 3 babies Thomas Bellmont had ripped from her arms were the only children she'd ever know, and she spent the rest of her life wondering what became of them. Daniel, the young man who helped carry Thomas's body to the cotton field, settled in Ohio and worked as a blacksmith. He married a formerly enslaved woman named Clara and had 4 children. He never told them the full story of what happened at Bellmont, only that he'd escaped and that they should never take their freedom for granted. His descendants still live in Ohio today, scattered across Cleveland and Cincinnati, most of them unaware of the role their ancestor played in killing a slave master in 1850. Marcus and Isaiah both died within 10 years of reaching freedom. Marcus from a work accident. Isaiah from pneumonia. Neither lived to see the end of slavery. But they died as free men, and that mattered. The Bellmont plantation itself became a ghost. After the Civil War, the land was subdivided and sold to white farmers who had no connection to the Bellmont family. The main house, already damaged during the war, was torn down in 1872. The quarters were burned. The breeding cabins, those 4 structures that had caused so much suffering, were dismantled and their wood used for other buildings. By 1900, there was no physical evidence that Thomas Bellmont had ever existed. No monument. No marker. Just empty fields and fading memories. But in the 1930s, something remarkable happened. The Works Progress Administration, a New Deal program, sent interviewers across the South to record the testimonies of formerly enslaved people before they all died. In Mississippi, an elderly woman named Rebecca gave an interview in which she described her childhood on a plantation in Issaquena County. She didn't name the plantation, but the details matched Bellmont perfectly. The breeding cabins. The forced pairings. The master who kept meticulous records. And she mentioned, almost in passing, that the master had died suddenly one night and that everyone on the plantation knew it wasn't an accident. The interviewer didn't press for details, and Rebecca didn't offer them. But the testimony was recorded and archived, a fragment of truth preserved in a government document. Modern historians have pieced together what happened at Bellmont using that testimony, along with probate records, census data, and plantation ledgers that survived the war. The picture that emerges is both horrifying and inspiring. Horrifying because of the systematic cruelty. Inspiring because of the resistance. The people enslaved at Bellmont didn't accept their fate passively. They fought back in the only way they could, and when the opportunity arose, they acted with courage and determination. Thomas Bellmont's death was not an accident. It was justice delivered by the people he'd tormented for 15 years. Today, the land where Bellmont Plantation once stood is farmland. Soybeans grow where cotton once did. Tractors roll over soil that was tilled by enslaved hands. Occasionally, someone walking the fields will find a rusted nail or a broken piece of pottery, remnants of a world that existed nearly 2 centuries ago. But there's no historical marker. No museum. No acknowledgement that this land was the site of profound human suffering and extraordinary human courage. The story of Thomas Bellmont and the people who killed him has been erased from official history. Until now. This story matters because it challenges the narrative of slavery as a system that crushed all resistance. It didn't. Enslaved people fought back constantly, in ways large and small. They sabotaged equipment. They slowed their work. They ran away. They preserved their families and cultures despite every effort to destroy them. And sometimes, when the circumstances aligned, they killed their oppressors. These acts of resistance were rarely recorded. When they were framed as crimes, as evidence of the supposed savagery of enslaved people rather than the justified response to unspeakable cruelty. But the truth is more complicated and more powerful than the sanitized version of history we're often taught. Thomas Bellmont died because he believed human beings were property. He died because he treated mothers as breeding stock and children as commodities. He died because he pushed people beyond the breaking point and assumed they'd never push back. He was wrong. And his death, however it's recorded in the archives, was a victory for every person he'd ever hurt. It was a message that echoed through the quarters of every plantation in the South. Tyrants are not invincible. Cruelty will be answered. Justice, even when delayed and imperfect, will come. The people who killed Thomas Bellmont paid a price. Some died trying to reach freedom. Others lived with the weight of what they'd done for the rest of their lives. But they also lived. They built families. They worked jobs of their choosing. They voted after the Civil War. They sent their children to school. They created futures that Thomas Bellmont had tried to steal from them. And in doing so, they won. Not just the battle, but the war. Because slavery ended. Because their descendants are free. Because the world Thomas Bellmont wanted to preserve crumbled into dust. This is the story of the cruel master who bred slaves in 1850 and how his end silenced an entire plantation. It's a story of darkness and light. Of cruelty and courage. Of oppression and resistance. It's a story that should never be forgotten. Because the past shapes the present. Because understanding history helps us build a better future. Because the voices of those who suffered and fought back deserve to be heard. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you why history matters, then do 3 things. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, because this conversation needs to continue. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The truth has power. Let's make sure it spreads. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just something that happened. It's something we carry with us every single day.